Welcome to the Product Quest podcast. Thank you for joining us on our journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Jonathan Edwards, and joining me as always, my co-hosts Jan Vermouth and Scott Burleson. In this episode, we continue our exploration of the Cynefin framework and how to apply it to innovation. We've already discussed it in a previous episode, episode 64 with Tom Kerwin, and we now want to look at it from another perspective. I'm personally particularly excited to talk to our guest today because he's an engineer, a builder. He's in the field actually building solutions, meaning he has first-hand experience with the challenges of turning the output of a discovery process, such as an idea or some other form of direction, into the delivery of an actual concrete product. This space between the idea or the output of the discovery process and the actual realization of the idea is not one we have discussed much on this podcast, and I look forward to exploring it further. Our guest today is William Bartlett. William is an active software engineer. He's also an Agile coach and speaker. William has also a very interesting blog where he mostly writes in French, so sorry to all non-French speaking listeners, but he also has some articles in English, and it's some really interesting thoughts. He's also very active in the Cynefin community, and in our discussion, we will cover William's journey from Agile in the sense of the project management framework, to where he is today and how he tries to integrate these ideas in his thinking and in his work. So William Bartlett, welcome to the Product Quest podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited for this discussion.
Okay, so I think you have a very interesting background. I think you are the first active engineer, I'd say, that we're interviewing on the podcast. So maybe we could just start by talking about how you, your journey. So what's your background? How did you get into this more, let's say, fluffy area of management, Agile, this kind of stuff? What's your background?
Yeah, so thank you for considering me a builder. So I'm a computer engineer from very early on. My dad is a computer engineer as well, still active. He would consider I'm much more philosophical than he is. So maybe I'm bridging the gap. I don't know. And some philosophical majors might find me too down to earth. I've got interested in computer science at an early age. My dad had one of the first portable, in air quotes, computers. That meant that it was a computer where the screen was integrated with the keyboard in the sort of central in the casing, and it had a little wheelie suitcase to fit it all in. So you kind of wheeled your portable computer around. I had an email account very early on. Was a number at CompuServe.net. And so, I started messing around with BASIC and then after a few years, my dad said, okay, now you've got to graduate a bit. You've got to get to more serious things. He plopped the C programming language, the book by Koenig and Ritchie, a core book for anybody who's done programming in the last few decades. And he said, yeah, you need to get into that. So I got through the first few chapters, very good book from a pedagogy side of things. But when I got to pointers at age 10, 11, pointers were just too much for my brain at the time. So I kind of put it to one side, got into other things and brought it back when I was a bit older, more mature, did some Java and stuff. And around 2000, 2001, my dad as well stumbled across the website for extreme programming. Very innovative website at the time. It's still the same website now, 20 years later, and it hasn't aged well. But a lot of the concepts are really, really cool and are coming back in the Agile community, trying to come back to revive some of them. And we went through that, and then I got into the Agile Manifesto, Scrum, Kanban, and etc. So, that was kind of my first couple decades. Yeah.
The extreme programming and Agile, is this like the same thing, or is there a...
No. So Now, defining agile is a sticky question. So for some, agile is pretty much defined either by the Agile Manifesto that came out in 2001. So the collaboration at the Snowbird Resort in ski resort in Utah, where various new project management practitioners in the IT community came together and kind of got together and agreed on certain values and core concepts, principles that they wanted to see in project management in the IT industry. So that tends to be regarded as a defining point for Agile. Now, today, with the history of Agile, that might not be. There are less and less people who will define Agile by only the manifesto, and then extreme programming is one of the feeders into the Agile Manifesto. So extreme programming predates it. The other feeds were Scrum with Ken Schwaber, I think, and Jeff Sutherland. And then there was DSDM. There was also the actual term came from lean agile manufacturing. So that was like Jim Highsmith brought some of that influence in. So I wouldn't equate extreme programming with Agile.
Okay, so Scrum, I actually always thought Scrum came after Agile, but all these, so Scrum, extreme programming, DSDM, not sure what that is. You said they all kind of fed into this movement.
Yeah, most of those things were invented in the 90s. Scrum was in during the 90s. Extreme programming during the 90s. DSDM, I'm a bit more hazy on the origins. There was also Crystal Clear framework by Alistair Coburn. That was, I think, the 90s. And then the Agile Manifesto was 2001. So the term Agile, as it's understood today in the IT industry, sort of originated around that time.
And what problem were all these people trying to address? I mean, it seems there's a lot of activity going on there, but I mean, what were all these people trying to do, really?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that because 2001 I was a teenager, and so I have a different perspective than maybe the co-authors. But what I understand from the time that I came across it, and also from going back and trying to go back to some of the originating text, shall we say, of that movement, to get a better perspective on what we can do now in the future. It seems to me that the manifesto was really I'm thinking of the French term, sorry, but it was kind of, we're fed up. We're fed up with what's being done at the moment. There's a better way. So that sort of we're fed up was already 10, 15 years in the making. So
and what was being done? What was being done in the moment then? What was the approach?
The big enemy was Waterfall. The big enemy was Waterfall, which I can't remember the year. It was like was it in the 70s or the 60s? There was this article that in a management journal that the anecdote the story goes that it was kind of a joke. Waterfall was meant to be very iterative with permeable phases, but then project managers just kind of lapped it up and made it very rigid and used it to some people say, like Robert Martin would say, because they had a need to sort of wrangle these young engineers, because IT before it was there weren't people who came into IT straight from college, straight from university. There were no university courses at the beginning of IT. People reconverted from other fields, and so they knew how to be a professional person. They knew about deadlines. They knew about discussions. They knew about teams and everything. And then one interpretation is that managers used Waterfall to kind of control these newcomers to the field. People who are graduating with CS degrees.
And so Waterfall, as I understand it, is basically you start by formulating some kind of plan and then you execute on it. Was that a fair kind of simple explanation?
Very yes, and with no going back on prior decisions, and hence the image of the waterfall.
I mean, that seems quite a reasonable thing to do. I mean, that's definitely a way I would like to work is, okay, make a plan and then try and, execute on it. So what is really the problem with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's a question that you probably come across in design, in other fields. It's not just an IT question. And I think the real world is the answer. It's the world is messy. It's not quite as clear cut. It's not quite as easy as we might want it to be. Yes, we have the scientific method, but that doesn't mean that science hasn't covered everything. We still have so many more questions to be answered. And when we answer one, we kind of find three new ones. Just think about language. I mean, so I'm British American. I was born in America. I spent a few years in England, and then I've been living in France for 25 years. I mean, the differences between American English and British English is, my parents would have fights, and sometimes it was just about differences in language. And then you add the French language. It's not totally different, like Japanese might be, or Chinese, but there are huge differences sometimes in certain ways of expressing yourself, and that does have it puts pressure on the kind of ideas that we gravitate towards. So there's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which has a weak form and a strong form, where the strong form is that your language constrains completely the kind of ideas you can have, and that is usually discredited. It's very likely untrue. Whereas the weak form, the language that you speak, the words that you speak, the dialect, and the kind of vocabulary that you have, kind of exerts a sort of downward force on the kind of ideas that you will gravitate towards. That is has some acceptance, and I think has some good grounding from various experiments. So yeah, just the messiness of life and the world makes it that certain things are unpredictable.
So when did you discover this? So you told us that your father introduced you to extreme programming, etc. So did you use this agile methodology in the workspace? I guess you did. Can you give us maybe? I mean, did you find it work well? I mean, what was your experience with that?
Well, so funnily enough, so I discovered it as a teenager, and so the first time I actually applied it was at school, was in engineering school. And so we had a couple of the courses were team projects, and so like I think there was a course where they taught us like Waterfall and Gantt charts and stuff, but we hadn't quite done that in the first team project. And so I just came to the team that we had, and I said, I know this thing. Look at this website. Oh wow, it's so cool for the 2000s. Do you guys want to try it? I mean, I've never really used it. I know a bit about it. Shall we try it? So we tried it a bit, and yeah, we didn't apply it all. Like TDD, test driven development, we hadn't really learned automated testing very well, so we didn't do it. But some of the practices were really interesting, and I kind of gravitated. I did a lot of coding, but I gravitated towards a slightly product ownerish role. And there were times where I saw, okay, we made this plan. This plan doesn't seem to be working. There's like no reason for us to continue this plan as it is. And so I just went and said to the guys, I think we should just take a break here, take a breather, get the whole team together. We split into two sub teams. And I said, let's just have a quick, whole team meeting and discuss this. What do you guys think? And they were like, oh yeah, this doesn't make sense. Let's go do that. And so we just put a quick stop on the project. We all got together and said, okay, here are the constraints. Here's what we're seeing. Here are the actions that are causing problems. How can we adjust this plan and set a new plan. And in the debrief at the end of the project, a lot of my classmates pointed to that moment and said, that was a really critical moment in the project, because otherwise we would have lost a heck of a lot of time and our grade would have been a lot less. So that was my first experience in applying that.
And when you say it didn't, sorry, Jan, I'll give you I see you have a question. Just to ask this one first. So when you say it didn't, there was a problem, are you talking about a problem on, I imagine, on the technical side, on the feasibility side? Yeah. Because I think this is something I'm also curious we'll get into maybe after, is also this distinction between the discovery, like, is it a problem about what you're building, or the feasibility, can we build it? But we'll get into that a bit later. Okay, so on the feasibility. Jan, you had a question.
Well, I was going to think same direction. I was really wondering, like, from the outside of, I mean, I'm far from software engineer, but like, can you tell us a little bit more, where does this unpredictability come from, or what makes it the case that projects like that, or IT projects in general, seem to have this core of unpredictability compared to maybe other processes that we know in the business world, or we have more these kind of expectation of planability and all that stuff? Can you
I have one idea about that. Now, this is a hypothesis, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. Still today, but then in this project at school, one of the things that was lacking was experience. We thought that we knew how to build something, and when the rubber hit the road, we just figure out that we didn't. There were mismatches in the API that we wanted to build between the two sub teams. That as soon as we started building it, we realized it wasn't going to work. And still today, one of the quips I have is that a lot of the industry, the sort of the market cap of the IT industry, is ballooned by incompetence. And I put myself clearly in there. Just we're trying to build things trying to build things on platforms that we just don't have enough experience on. And I say enough, it's like we don't have enough experience on sometimes to give the predictability that we want.
Yeah.
So and there's a growing appeal of doing boring architecture. So it's like, let's not give ourselves too many challenges at once. Let's not change the runtime, the server runtime, and the programming language, and the communication API, the protocols, and the team, and let's just change maybe one or two things at a time, and just stick to, I know that you guys want to do some Kotlin because it's the hot thing, but in this project, that would be changing too many things. We're starting with a new database system, so let's stick to a Java. Let's stick to having semicolons, having to put semicolons. I know you guys hate that, but this is what will make the most sense and will give us the less risk.
But I think it's I wanted to extend your question, because I think it's a really good question, Jan. When you think about building a dam or something like this, I mean, this is a pure waterfall thing. No one would think, let's do an agile building of this dam and test it. But so what is it really? I'm repeating the question, but I do find it's interesting. What is it about software that makes Agile such makes it important? I mean, where is this difference in your opinion?
There's another. So I think there's another axis, another point that is put across a long time with Agile is, so there's not just necessarily knowledge of the tools that we're using to implement, but it's also knowledge of the domain that we're trying to implement. So the sort of the problem space. So let's say one of my first missions was in banking and in finance, and I'd had a few classes in finance, but I had no idea what a foreign exchange swap was. So I had to learn what the characteristics of that was, why it was different from other types of swaps, why it was different from bonds and stocks and so on, and some of the characteristics that were key for that, so I could properly implement the system that I needed to implement. So there's the the tools, the being fluent with the tools that you're using, but then there's also like the domain knowledge, and that's the one of the points that becoming more familiar with the problem space that is often pointed to. And one sub point on that is that computer science in its nature is making knowledge extremely explicit.
Yeah.
And there's a difficulty in that, is that there are two types of knowledge. There's tacit knowledge and there's explicit knowledge. So tacit knowledge goes to Michael Polanyi and his book, The Tacit Dimension. And tacit knowledge by nature is knowledge that is very difficult to codify. So you may be able to codify some of it, but in codified form, it might not even have the same impact. So the two examples that I like to use are riding a bicycle. Would you give a child, would you even give an adult a textbook on how to ride a bicycle, and then first time they will do it? Yeah. No, you just say, okay, let's go outside. It's a clear day. There's a slight decline there. So just put your feet up and I'll push you and just feel the balance. And if there's a problem, then just put your feet down and you just repeat, and you sort of acquire this tacit knowledge of what it is to keep your balance on a bicycle, and then start pedaling. And there's sometimes with the children, there's the sticky moment of, I'll hold you. Don't let go, Dad. Don't let go. No, I'll hold you. It's okay. And then you let go, and then it's, when you let go, but it's okay. You're going to learn it. So that's one example. And then another example, sort of in the coder space, is keyboard shortcuts. So a lot of people have, for their favorite tools, they have these little cheat sheets with keyboard shortcuts on them, or you can go into the menu and you can learn the keyboard shortcuts. But why is a keyboard shortcut useful? It's when you know it by heart. Yeah. So these cheat sheets are great to get you going. They're kind of the training wheels. But the whole point of a keyboard shortcut is to make you go faster. So if you're looking it up on the cheat sheet, then you're not actually being effective.
Mm-hmm.
So
can I? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to. Well, okay. The way I have come into touch with at least the word agile was from a very, let's say, fluffy understanding of agile. Like agile means, bro, it's hard to say what it really means, but it's like a very like, okay, we do it differently and we use sticky notes, kind of. So I'm being black and white here, but basically it's that understanding. And one aspect which kind of made sense to me is that somebody says, well, we work in this more, in brackets, loose way. I don't think that would be correct, but more loose way, because the time it takes to develop, in the meantime, the demands of the project have changed. Like kind of, so there seems to be something like an influence of, while we develop, and then it's, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months, 12 months later, and the context has changed, demands have changed, and you kind of need to adapt to that as well. Or was that something that we kind of discovered after the fact, that was a usefulness of agile, or was that from the beginning you see what I mean?
That was definitely from the beginning, and that kind of ties into what I was saying about the problem, learning about the problem space, and yes, the problem space moving. It's a moving target, and also one thing that I can't attribute this quote properly, which I probably should, but it's users don't know what they want until they get it, and then they want something completely different. So
that's a nice addition. I usually know the first two, and then okay, yeah.
So there's domain experts who don't come from IT, who haven't built things in IT. They don't necessarily know what IT can give them, and they don't always know what to ask for. So in more modern methods, we'd have things like domain-driven design, which is a way, or it's got a few different methods inside it, where one of them is called, there's event storming and there's knowledge crunching, which have similar uses, where you're going to just have these slightly facilitated conversations with between IT specialists and domain experts. And you're just trying to map out the space that we want to implement. And you know that because, as I said, knowledge, there's the explicit, the tacit. You're not going to be able to implement all the knowledge that the domain expert has. That would take an eternity and probably likely be unusable. You're trying to figure out what is the little area of the domain expertise that I can model, that I can make explicit, and then figure out, and then try and build that quickly, just build a rough version of that, get some feedback. Oh yeah, by using that, well, I forgot to tell you guys, but there's this option that we need to have. Otherwise it doesn't work. There's some special case that we forgot to tell you about. Because knowledge is very difficult to, especially tacit knowledge, is very difficult to volunteer. You really only are aware of what you know when you need to know it. So that's a principle from knowledge management from Dave Snowden, who's the creator of Cynefin. Yeah.
So, okay, so you've gone from Waterfall, discovered Agile, and you've been using it. Sounds brilliant. So now you are also, I mean, not just you, quite a lot of people are actually also questioning Agile itself. So maybe, well, actually, before going into this, sorry, I would like to maybe just specify a bit what for you are the key points of Agile, because Jan was trying to formulate it, but I think it is something that's not quite clear, and the manifesto is very short. But what would you say are the salient things, if you'd like to explain in 2 sentences?
Yeah, sometimes I fall back on something. I think it's Dave Thomas that kind of had this quick 2-point summary. It's just like build something, get feedback, change what you built. So it's sort of some people also use the PDCA loop, the Deming cycle, to describe Agile. So plan, do, check, or study, and then act. And yeah, in Agile, there's this notion of iteration and learning. So we get a first rough draft, we go try and build something, then we see how it works. We kind of step back and think, oh, how is this wrong? How is this not getting us towards the goal that we might have had? Okay, well, let's adjust our plan and do it quickly, and do it at least as quickly as feasible, because as we previously mentioned, the universe is the world around us is changing at the same time, and so the target is moving at the same time. So yeah, iterate, learn is kind of a quick summary.
Okay, great. Okay, so then now we're all kind of clear on what it means. So now to my question. So it sounds brilliant. So why have you started questioning it? And maybe if you have an experience where you had problems using it, please share.
Yeah. So one of my first things before discovering other things other than Agile, one of the first difficulties was becoming an Agile coach, sort of trying not just sort of using it with teams, but actually actively trying to help teams to start using it and at scale as well. I started in 2016, I started coaching multi-team environments in Agile. And one of the first big shocks for me was teaching them these principles that just seemed so obvious to me now that I'd seen them. I'd been looking at them for 16 years and I had already implemented them in a few different areas. And just getting the shock that what was coming out of my explanation was not what I thought I would see. I wasn't seeing the results that I was getting. And funny enough, at the time, I was questioning a little bit my explanation, but I wasn't questioning it enough. And we'll probably get back into that later. But for me, Agile was the solution. Waterfall was the enemy at the time. And so I was convinced that Agile was correct. It was just that they weren't doing Agile. People were also asking questions when I was diving in, trying to explain Agile to newcomers. They were asking questions that, for me, they felt obvious. They were kind of getting into loopholes, sort of picking at things and saying, "Oh, but then it won't work because you're doing that." And then I'm saying, "Well, no. Don't you remember I explained this other thing? There's kind of this safety net in Scrum, and so because you can do this because you're doing this other thing, and so it all kind of works. It all kind of falls into place." And so this kind of falling into place, it wasn't clicking for the people that I was trying to explain it to. And so one of the questions, and I know that many Agile coaches had the exact same experience, was what is missing? And the elephant in the room was that everybody was thinking, well, Agile is obviously the good thing. We're not questioning Agile. So what is missing? Well, it must be something on the other end. We're explaining it well because we're reciting the manifesto off by heart. We're having them repeat it back to us as well. So but there's something that's not clicking. So where is this thing not clicking? It must be in the brain. And so this term mindset started being bandied about around the community. It must be the mindset. So there's especially a book by Gil Broza, I think it was, who wrote the Agile Mindset, and Ahmed Sidki did another book as well. I can't remember the title, but he had this very famous graphic which had the principles of the practices, the many practices. You had the 12 principles of the Agile Manifesto. You had the 4 values, and it was a funnel towards the mindset. There was this one mindset, and that was the core thing. It wasn't the values, it wasn't the practices of the manifesto, it wasn't the principles, and it wasn't the practices. People seem to be focusing too much on the practices, not enough on the values and the principles, and especially not enough on what was deemed the mindset behind all that thing. So even I adopted this heavily, lent into it in my training. I would have people repeat many times during the training. I really cringe at it, but I think it's important to share. Very sorry to anybody who I've trained this way. It was a huge mistake. I had people repeat, okay, Agile is first and foremost a mindset. And so that kind of was okay-ish. At the time, at least in my thought. What started gnawing at me was that, okay, we're telling people it's a mindset. Well, which one? It's just saying it's a mindset. It isn't really explaining too much. It's kind of saying, well, something needs to happen in the brain. It's not just the values, it's not the principles. Something needs to click in the brain. Okay, but what click? Is it the same mindset in other fields? Probably not. And so I looked around. I didn't see many people having the same problem of definition. And so I just thought, well, I'll get the ball rolling. I'll just posit a definition. It will be wrong. People will want to correct me, and that will launch the discussion. Unfortunately, it didn't really seem, or at least my launching didn't get the ball rolling. I posited a definition of what kind of mindset, and a few other people. In retrospect, I came across a few talks of other Agile practitioners trying to go into this, defining the type of mindset that we wanted. But yeah, that was another problem, another hurdle. And then the coup de grace on this journey, this little arc here, was coming across through the whims of the YouTube algorithm, a talk by a certain Dave Snowden. I think it was the how leaders change culture through small actions. And it was very intriguing. He kind of completely demolished the idea of mindset. He even gave reasons for why it was a huge problem, multiple reasons, which I kind of take up and try and explain in French for people who aren't English speakers. So that in the French-speaking world, they can also benefit from this kind of knowledge. But go into many reasons why the mindset is really, really problematic to be defining Agile as a mindset. And so that kind of completed a bit of an arc. And to finish on kind of where I was when I watched that first talk by Dave Snowden, Dave sometimes says he wants, at the end of his talk, he wants a third of his audience inspired, a third angry, and a third confused. And I think I was in all three.
I'm often in the confused one, I have to say.
Yeah, but I was inspired. I was inspired because he was not giving anybody who was critiquing Agile on my radar up to them was coming from Waterfall. It was Waterfall's the way, Agile is not. So I was used to getting critiques from there. I was prepared for that. Dave was not making that critique. I was confused because this Cynefin thing, first of all, how do you pronounce it? How do you write it? It's just what? And I was angry because on the face of it, some of the things that he was saying I found very paradoxical. It seemed to me like he was critiquing one thing and then proposing something that would fall victim to the same critiques. So yeah, that was kind of one of my journeys into seeing the chinks in the armor of Agile.
Do you remember still what those statements were that made you angry?
Unfortunately, I don't. I probably should have written that down in hindsight. Now that I know a bit more about lessons learned and lessons learning stuff, I should have written it down. But no, I don't quite remember.
I have to ask, what
sorry,
are the chinks in the armor of Agile?
Well, so if we look at Cynefin, well, there's the first thing about the mindset. We could go into the whole mindset thing if you want at one point. And then if you look at Cynefin, one of the core lessons of Cynefin is that there are many different types of contexts. Each domain in Cynefin is a different sort of class of contexts. There's no method that works everywhere. But up until I came across Cynefin, we would just sort of repeat, it was this religion that Agile was the way everywhere. I was even kind of saying, people were saying, well, there are some cases where Waterfall works well. And I was like, okay, I'll concede the point. But I was saying that, well, Agile would manifest itself in that context because Agile is Agile. You're going to change the way you do it. Well, in the context where Waterfall would be appropriate, Agile would kind of morph into a Waterfall-like thing. So I was kind of weaseling around trying to win the argument, but with a very poor, with a bit of a fallacy there. So there's bounded applicability to any method, according to Cynefin. Yeah. And as soon as you get that, well, you need to bound. Where are the bounds of Agile? And then I think the last chink in the armor is the definition, which we've already stumbled across a couple of times. My definition of Agile is not going to be the same as somebody else. I've had many arguments about how to define Agile, and it's very complicated. So I don't even give my definition at the moment. I have a talk where I kind of say, well, here are the problems. Let's open it up. Here are some of the coherent avenues where we could try and define Agile in a better way. But I don't even bench my own definition anymore.
I'd love to get your reaction to, I guess, what has been my perception of Agile over the years. So at my company, we at least claim to use Agile. We use 2-week sprints. And for the most part, I think you would recognize it as Agile. However, sometimes there are bits of software that need to be created. It's just a bigger project. And so we have a designer, and it really becomes more of a waterfall for a particular application or whatever. It becomes like, well, we need to build this much bigger thing, and we need to build this bigger thing. It just doesn't make sense to do it in little bits, and that can have to do maybe not only with what the ideal design is or the feedback, but just with the practicalities of working with software developers around the world. So my sort of the conclusion I've sort of come to is that like Agile and Waterfall is really this is what I want you to react to. It's really a continuum. And it's like, they're really the same thing. The only difference in what you call Waterfall, it's the scale of the thing. Like you're building this massive thing without lots of check-ins. Agile, it's just it's a smaller unit. It's just like a fractal. It's like a fractal view, if you will. And so because even if you're you love Agile, et cetera, you're still this little micro bit that you're building. At some point, you're still like, all right, we're going to build it, and before you're not getting feedback with every line of code. So the conclusion I came to, and I'm certainly not an expert here, but like Agile versus Waterfall is really of a continuum of how large the unit that you're working on. I'd love to get your reaction to that observation.
Yeah, I think it's a great observation. A couple of things is so if we take the lens of Cynefin. There are going to be there's you mentioned the keyword fractality. Fractal. Cynefin is fractal. We could say, well, the general thing is complex or complicated or clear or whatever. But there are generally going to be aspects of that system which are in other domains. In fact, in a large enough system, you will find enough aspects of all domains of Cynefin. And so there's that fractality, the multifacetedness of the project means that you're going to need multiple methods in combination. And that's one of the things I'm really trying to push. To your point about the continuum, I think that in another kind of universe, that would probably be the way to go. One of the things that Dave Snowden argues, and this is why he argues for some of the rigid boundaries in Cynefin, but not all of them, is that as humans, we kind of need boundaries. It's very difficult for us to reason in continuums without help of tools. So let's take, for instance, our perception of probabilities or our perception of percentages and numbers. In our perception, this has been measured. We have a bigger difference. We perceive a bigger difference between 0 and 1%, and between 1% and 2%, as we do between 10 and 11%. The difference between 50 and 51% is like nothing. In our brains, it's the same thing. We have no idea that, well, when it's 50%, we should do one thing a little bit differently. And when it's 51%, we should just do the same thing, but with a slight change. That sort of variability, that degree, our brains have difficult coping with that. And so it helps to have rigid boundaries at certain points. And with heuristics, so heuristics that are fallible, they're not necessarily perfect, but they're good rules of thumb that allow us to make decisions quickly. We have heuristics on deciding whether something's on the edge of a boundary or not. And then in Cynefin, we have the practice of when two people disagree on what side of a boundary something should be, we try and split it up. So go back to this fractality. We actually probably both right. If we disagree on something being complex or complicated, it's actually probably because there's an aspect that's complex and there's an aspect that's complicated, and we'll treat them slightly differently in the context.
So I think I would like to dig a bit more into these so chinks in the Agile. And maybe before that, I can make a little summary of what we've talked about as I understand it, just to make sure I also got where we're at. So, okay, Waterfall is problematic because we're working in software, but also other spaces with domains which are shifting or that are not necessarily very well defined. And therefore, you have something like Agile that comes along that allows you to use feedback loops in order to iterate on the project and adapt in a better way to your increase in knowledge. And then here the problem is when you want to actually transmit this notion of Agile, so you have the practitioners who are doing this, but you found, and not just you, but as you were trying to communicate this and teach this, people were not able to apply it. And so there's this notion of mindset that came about, but this mindset is problematic. Because what is the mindset, etc. Could you maybe at this stage just describe a bit what were the issues with applying Agile that you saw? What were the things that were not working? Just so it's a bit more palatable for people to understand.
Yeah. So one concrete example is from Scrum. There's the ritual of the daily stand-up meeting. The idea is to very quickly, like 10 to 15 minutes max, the whole team every day as given at a fixed time of day will come together and we'll discuss where we are in the project and what we're going to do today. Classic format is the 3 questions, which I've moved on from, but the 3 questions is: what did you do yesterday? What are you planning to do today? What are your impediments? What are the blockers that you might need help on? Today, I would actually ask one question. It's what are we going to do today to progress towards our goal? So it's a little bit different. But we'd give this training on this specific thing, and then we would go observe a few weeks later their daily the Scrum meetings. They were doing daily stand-up meetings. They were standing up. They were meeting, but nobody was listening to each other. Everybody was talking to the Scrum Master, everybody was talking to the agile coach who had absolutely no need to know this kind of information, or people were talking down, or the product owner was part of that meeting and was interrupting everybody, asking a whole bunch of questions. The thing would go on, instead of 15 minutes, it would go on for half an hour because people were standing up. It wasn't that the idea behind standing up is that it's supposed to make the meeting shorter. It actually never really made the meeting shorter. People would find ways of getting around that, leaning against a wall, leaning on a table, not standing up at all because now we're in remote, and so it doesn't really matter. And so people wouldn't listen to each other. It just wasn't effective. That's one example.
Yeah, almost too ritualistic, almost too scripted. Or what do you think or it was just that came across?
I think, well, ritual is important in humans. It's great. It serves, one of the purposes it serves is to make a cognitive switch from different roles. So one of the examples that Dave Snowden gives is washing hands. A surgeon washing their hands before operating. It's got a very good bacterial purpose, antibacterial purpose, but it's also a good cognitive purpose, is that it's mentally preparing the surgeon for going into surgery. In sports, you get sports players who are very superstitious, and one of my theories is that their superstition is actually helping them cognitively, because it's doing the same thing gets you into the same place more predictably. So I don't think it's the ritualizedness of it. I think it's that it's just not necessary for the environment that was there, for the context. It wasn't context specific enough. It was too scripted, as you say. Everybody gets the same script, whereas each team has different mannerisms, is trained different ways. And so just giving them the script wasn't going to make them act.
This reminds me a bit of this idea of the cargo cult.
Yeah.
Right. There's actually a story with that, which I've forgotten, but it's about, people doing rituals and doing things that have no causal effect on what you actually are trying to achieve, but because they've noticed a pattern. Something happened. So typically what you were saying about the sportsman, so them, hitting the ball 10 times before serving in tennis or something, because it worked once, so you do that again. So we have this. So we have basically these rituals. We have these cargo cults that people are following, but they're not getting to the essence. And of course, the obvious thing that people would say, I would have said the same thing. Oh, it's a mindset thing. But we've seen that is also not quite working. So before going into more of the what we can do about it, my question is now, how did teams ever make it work? So what's the story of teams? Did you actually find teams that did make it work?
Yeah. So I've had the privilege to be on a few teams that for which it worked. If you look back to some of the first cases where extreme programming or Scrum were developed, those projects had success. One of the difficulties, another problem in Agile, is the lack of scientific rigor of its validation. It used very much a discovery paradigm, but not so much a validation paradigm. So there was a lot of ideation, but not a lot of checking of hypotheses. And so one of the problems is that we might have a correlation versus causation problem in the practices that were codified. The people who had success didn't codify the things that actually made it work, which were possibly the skill sets, the timing, the environment, the managers that were in place, so many parameters that could have been codified that weren't. And then there's the other thing of transmission. Even if you codify it, there's so much tacit knowledge. That's what I tend to try and replace mindset with, is that there's tacit knowledge. There's a sort of craft, not only to computer science, but also to running an agile project. And this can't be learnt in a 2-day course. It's got to be something that's mentored, that's that's passed down as well, much like handcraft would be passed down from generation to generation.
So generally, the problem is not really with this idea of having a feedback loop. It's really more about how people are actually putting that into action and acting upon this, or how they're making it their behaviors, basically. So do you have any how do you teach it now? I mean, what's the right, how do you do it then? Have you found a way of?
I wouldn't say I have the right
solution?
way.
What's the solution?
I do not have the solution. I'm going to go. Bye-bye.
Oh.
No, I don't have the solution. I have some ideas. So this is why I'm very interested in just discovering Cynefin and Dave Snowden's work was kind of a pivotal moment for me, going into other things as well, looking more into other sciences. So like psychology, ecological psychology, 4E cognition. I'm just throwing out these terms. You can look them up. But things about how teams work together effectively, various different theories. This really interests me, and knowledge management as well. These things interest me more and more, to be able to try and find more coherent solutions. Not saying that I'm going to stumble across the solution, be all and end all, but at least I'll be trying things that if you take certain fields of science, the science doesn't contradict what I'm trying. And that's a important notion in Cynefin, is that when you have uncertainty, you try multiple different things, but you also don't try things that are incoherent with the facts and with our current understanding of how the world works. So one of the things that, because I kind of think that it's not a mindset anymore, it's more of a problem of tacit knowledge, and how we transfer tacit knowledge from one practitioner to another. I have a much bigger focus on practice, and I change a little bit on how I talk about theory. For me, it's not just practice. Practice needs to be informed by theory, but it's how we get people to think about those theories that's important. So having sort of putting people into situations where they're going to have to think differently, otherwise they will not succeed. Those are things that are very good from a pedagogy point of view. One of the examples I love to do, and I really crack up when I run this workshop. So it's not my workshop, but it's a thing that's called Try or Die the Experiment. I'm going to quickly look up, while I'm talking about it, the attribution, because so it's a thing where we force people to be in a completely complex state. And so I set up where I have a sort of various different objects, a few pieces of Lego, a book, a pencil, things that you might, in French we call a vide-poche, things that you have a little tray at your door where you empty your pockets. So I don't know if in English we have a term for that, but so you take things like that. It's just sort of things that, like puzzle pieces that don't go to the puzzle anymore. You don't have the rest of the puzzle anymore. Just things that, nonsense objects. And you put them on a table. You have various different groups doing this in parallel. And you have a deck of cards with objectives. These are things that the groups have to do. And you set off a session, an iteration of 2 minutes. A customer comes to the table. They draw 4 cards, and the group have to do what is written on the cards. However, the customer cannot say anything. All they can do is observe what the group are doing. And as soon as the group does one of the things on the cards, they put the card down on the table. That is the only thing. The question I often get when I explain the rules is, are we allowed to ask questions to the customers? Because obviously I've done a few other workshops, more basic workshops, where I've drilled home the fact that you need to interact with your customers more. And so I get the questions, are we allowed to ask questions to the customer? I said, yeah, you can ask away. They just can't answer. They just have to be completely stoic, closed-faced. And so people are forced to try things. They can't act, they can't plan, they can't ask the customer for what their job to be done is, or whatever framework you want to apply there. And very quickly after the little brain fart is they just start trying things. And then we do a couple iterations and I sort of give them a few pointers, and it's just real fun. Just people trying more and more insane things. And what's funny is that the cards have very little to do with the objects that are on the table. There's one like you have to go out of the room and back again and come back in. So, and they start to get to this feeling for thinking outside the box. And so just that, I think, is the kind of pedagogy we need to focus more on. Things that force people to think differently so that then they think, oh, the theory that I have now doesn't work. Or at least it doesn't work in all situations. So we come back to that bounded applicability. Waterfall isn't the problem. Waterfall applied in situations where it's not applicable is the problem. Agile isn't the problem. It's Agile applied outside of its boundaries. That's the problem. And here, with this situation, neither Waterfall nor Agile applies. And I think in our current context, that's why I use this workshop a lot, because people are stuck on this war between Agile and Waterfall, and they're not even thinking that there's even third and fourth and six other things that could be weighed in the balance.
So I found this very interesting because I have to say I didn't. When before talking, I pictured going in a slightly different direction, in the sense that I hadn't realized. So the problem is really about how you transmit this. It's in the behaviors on how to actually perform the Agile. And in my mind, I had the fact that, okay, maybe Agile as a general idea doesn't work, So I think it was very interesting to me that actually the problem here is really more about how do you get people to behave in an Agile way rather than the Agile itself. So I thought it was super interesting. Where can people find out more about you and connect with you?
Yeah, so with multi-millionaires or billionaires sort of wreaking havoc on the social network space, at the moment, the most stable ways to reach me are LinkedIn and Mastodon. And then I have a blog on Medium where, as you said, I blog sometimes in French, sometimes in English. Some of the articles I try and spend time to put them in both languages. But yeah, definitely. I'm always open to questions or arguments or criticism on LinkedIn. And then if I have time, if this topic interests me, then we can set up a video chat or whatever.
And you also have a website that I'll maybe mention because people can then branch out to all your different different outlets. So it's namrats.net, right?
Yeah. My nickname is Starman, and so because starman.net was obviously taken, I just reversed it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the first page isn't maintained very, very often. I think the last post I put on it was from 2020, but the second page with the different links to the social
exactly
links,
exactly. I think
you can even
nice.
find my board game collection on there. So if you're interested.
Yes, very good. So anyway, this was a real pleasure and very interesting to finally know a bit more about the whole history of Agile, which has always been a bit of a fuzzy topic for me. So thank you very much, William Bartlett. This concludes today's Product Quest podcast. So please send any comments or ideas for future shows to productquestpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time. Okay,
great experience. Hope to
it was very nice.
Talk to you again.
Okay, have a great evening and speak soon.
Yeah, bye.